The Catholic Deaf newspaper printed an article by a deaf man written from somewhere in France on the 5th of February 1916. The author's name is not given. In the article, the deaf author describes his experiences working for the Red Cross during the First World War. Its unknown author gave it the title How an Irish Deaf Mute Reached the Firing Line and What Befell Him There. This is what the deaf man wrote. Years ago, I left St. Joseph's Cabra. I went home to the south of Ireland. A Christian brother named Byrne, who was a teacher of mine, had warned me to settle down and find work as a harness maker. If I didn't apply myself to a job, I would end up in the workhouse. To avoid this, and to please my mother, I began to make harnesses. Then Mother died, and 6 months later, the First World War began. I went to Dublin and pretended to be a seaman. I boarded a ship. I stole into the interior of the vessel and ended up in the engine room. The ship got underway, bound for Liverpool, England. A man in the engine room found me, but he simply handed me a shovel. He gestured to me, "You, start loading the coal into the furnace." I wondered, how could this man know I was deaf? I shovelled coal. It was only later that I realised everyone in the engine room relied on gestures to get by. The machinery was too noisy to speak. The next morning we arrived in Liverpool and I disembarked. Dockside, I ran into a man in his 30s who was carrying many parcels. The man began speaking to me and so I gestured that I was deaf. To my astonishment, he signed back to me in American Sign Language. Years before, a deaf teacher from St. Joseph's named Tom Mahon had taught me how American and Irish sign languages were different. He signed, "Are you a deaf mute?" I signed back that yes, I was. "And do you live here?" he asked. I signed, "No, I'm in from Ireland." He was surprised. "You're Irish?" I answered him, "Yes, I am." He at once grabbed me and gave me some hearty claps on my back. "I'm Irish as well," he beamed. "At least, my family is Irish. I'm an O'Connell, a New Yorker. I'm a doctor with the Red Cross. I'm off to France." "Will you help me get my supplies to the train station? Do you know the way?" I didn't, but I helped him until we found it. On our way, he signed to me rapidly, and I used my speech in reply. "Your school, was it Cabra or Belfast?" I told him I went to Cabra, of course. "So then you're a Catholic?" "Yes." He signed, "Well, so am I." I asked O'Connell how it was that he had learned sign language. He said that he had been a teacher in a deaf school many years before. "I'm a doctor now, but I can still sign. You understand me anyway." We arrived at the station only to find that he had missed his train. The doctor was suddenly livid. He berated the station manager and railed at other station staff, shoving stacks of papers at them. The staff seemed to be afraid then, confronted by all of his documents. To me, though, he winked and fingerspelled bluffing. I didn't know what that meant. "Huh? Who's that?" I asked. Dr. O'Connell had to pause, but then he roared with laughter. I later realised it meant that he was making fools of the railroad men. The next train arrived. He asked, "Want to go to France with me?" I immediately answered, yes. Even before he was saying he would pay my way and wages if I would do as bid, I would, yes. We went together to Paris and stayed in the Terminus Hotel. Dr. O'Connell arranged for me an American Red Cross passport. One day, out walking, I saw two men signing with each other. Their signs were unknown to me, but they seemed to be deaf. I asked if they were deaf like me. They stared, then exchanged glances. I fingerspelled American to them, remembering my passport, and they signed what I took to be, "You're red-faced," to which I agreed. They accompanied me back to the hotel terminus for some wine. They said a meeting of deaf people was that night at the Boc Lorraine. We went by taxi then to another bar, and this one was full of deaf patrons. Later, that same taxi driver would come in to interrupt the evening, handing me a note from Dr. O'Connell which read, "We're to leave at once." The doctor and I donned our new Red Cross uniforms for the first time, and we travelled once again by train to arrive in front of a field hospital. Inside, dozens of nurses tended to countless bandaged soldiers. Many of the wounds were terrible, a scene right out of a nightmare. Harried nurses and nuns strove to do all they could for their patients. Dr. O'Connell entered, signing to me, "Come on, bring my medical bag." We approached a man who was lying down in a sick bed. The man wore a full beard and his face was deeply tanned. The sick man grabbed my hand and looked at me intently. He spoke to Dr. O'Connell, who fingerspelled it to me. "You make a good team," he translated. "Please look after me." I nodded and asked the doctor, "What do we do now?" O'Connell replied, "Oh, now we cut off his leg." I brought his bag and he opened it to reveal numerous surgical tools. The wounded American soldier had been watching us sign. He spoke excitedly to the doctor, who seemed greatly interested. "This man says he has a deaf niece at a deaf school in Belgium. He can't find her now since the school has closed. He hopes she will turn up soon. Before that, though, he will be leaving one of his legs in France. And now we must get busy to do the procedure." And just like that, I was helping to saw this poor man's leg off, which, truth be told, was a horrifying experience. Dr. O'Connell told me that the operation was a success. After that, I went with the doctor everywhere, helping him to perform all of the most difficult surgeries, the critical ones for which the patients were on sedation. One day, Dr. O'Connell asked me, "Doesn't all of this ever get on your nerves?" I had to ask, "All of what?" "All the noise, it never stops. Oh, of course you cannot hear it. The ceaseless groans, the screams. That young boy has lost his eyes and he's now crying for his mother. The large man over there will never leave this hospital alive. He moans piteously for his wife and children back home in Prussia." "And such screams," said the doctor. "Oh yes, war is hell." Now this made me stop to think. If I had not been deaf, I could never have been able to withstand the ordeal. Dr. O'Connell is an expert at appendicitis operations. A little French girl next by was suffering great bowel pains. She was beautiful, fair-haired, only around 8 years old. Her mother had begged the doctor to operate and save her child. Dr. O'Connell agreed and brought her into surgery. He allowed both her mother and a French nurse to be present. The little girl came close to death, but the surgery resulted in success. However, just as the doctor was sewing her closed again, the girl regained consciousness and began to scream. Her mother screamed as well, and the French nurse dropped the tray of instruments as she fainted to the floor. In a flash, I leapt to collect the scattered instruments, remove the mother to a chair outside of the surgical room, and returned to press the child back down firmly onto the table. The good doctor had gone pale. Recovering himself, he called nurses to aid their fallen peer, vowing never again to allow outsiders into his surgery. Military authorities told me deaf men could not serve in war. I can say that this view betrays their very foolish prejudices. Deaf men can be of great use, particularly in hospitals. We deaf are not disturbed by all the chaos and horrible sounds. Perhaps the day will come when all of these prejudices fade away. Until then, I shall hope Dr. O'Connell and I may return home safe and sound.